Well, hey everyone, let's start with the question. And it's a question that's going to sound like a mild sacrilege maybe to people in a church environment, but it's a good question to ask. Why should anyone trust and follow Jesus? Now, at One Life, we say our mission is to help people who are far from God to trust and follow Jesus. We want them to do that, but why should anybody do that? I remember hearing great advice years ago that said, always start with your why. When you're involved in anything that's really important in your life, know why you're doing it, because the deeper you understand the why, the more enthusiastic you'll be about it, the more on point you'll be about it. Let me illustrate this. I'm going to illustrate this by giving an announcement at the same time. And the announcement is relevant to everything we're talking about, but it's still an announcement because we have something coming up I'm very excited about, and I think you should be very excited about. We're going to be doing an event called Because. Okay? And it's coming up in September, and at the event, we've done these as a church before, and what the event is when we gather up in a larger venue and we say, we're going to let the night be about worship, and it's just pretty much all music. We just worship God during the entire time, and they've been fabulous things to be a part of. Now, what we're also going to do, though, is we're going to lead up to that event with an entire series that's all about worship. And we're going to try to talk about worship from as many different angles as we possibly can, going for the why. Because the kind of odd name, Because, is all related to that. See, the Bible tells you that you ought to worship God. It says you should worship. But more often, it gives you reasons why you should worship. You see, because the whole premise behind Because is worship is not me trying to work up a feeling. It's me responding to truth. Worship is not me trying to work up a feeling. It's me responding to truth. And the more I understand that, the more meaningful my worship's going to be, and it's going to help me connect with God in a much more meaningful way, which is the entire objective. So when you think about that, apply it over to, why should I trust and follow Jesus? I mean, trusting him as a person, knowing that he has my best interest. Also, following him means to do life the way he wants me to do it and not how I just want to do it. Why should I do that? Well, today's story that we're going to be looking at from Jesus' life that we found in the book of Luke is great for this. I'm going to give you 2 reasons why you should trust and follow Jesus from this passage. Now, I could give you 200, and these 2 may not be the most important reasons, but they're reasons that as I was reading this passage, honestly, I was reminded, and this isn't one of the reasons I'm going to give, but it's a nice little side bonus, is you're reminded that Jesus is a really cool guy. He's awesome, and it's an honor to follow him. It's actually found in Luke chapter 13, beginning at verse 10. Here's how it reads. And he, speaking of Jesus, was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And there was a woman who for 18 years had had a sickness caused by a spirit. And she was bent double and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your sickness." And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made erect again and began glorifying God. But the synagogue official, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, began saying to the crowd in response, "There are 6 days in which work should be done, so come during them and get healed, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the stall and lead him away to water him? And this woman, a daughter of Abraham as she is, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, should she not have been released from this bond on the Sabbath day?" And as he said this, all his opponents were being humiliated, and the entire crowd was rejoicing over all the glorious things being done by him. Now, that's a great story. You can feel the vibrancy and goodness of it. But it brings up a couple of things. Again, why should I trust and follow Jesus? Again, number 1 is this. Why should I trust and follow Jesus? Because Jesus is about compassion. Because Jesus is about compassion. If you want to be on team compassion in your life and really have a heart for the less fortunate and those who need help and need a leg up in life and all of that whole picture, Jesus is the one you ought to be following because in many ways, he's the originator of that idea. And this story demonstrates it in a beautiful way. So let's kind of go back and let's kind of live inside the story a little bit. So it starts off where he was. Okay, so he was at a synagogue. And synagogues actually were the first churches. It's where Christians got the idea for having church buildings that you go and meet in on a certain day. This came from Jewish synagogues. They're still around today. I have a picture, though, of one. This is ruins from the time of Jesus. This was a synagogue that would have been around when he was living. Now, there's also here's an artist rendition that kind of has a cutaway so you can see what it would have looked like inside. And they would come, and this was a part of the community. Jewish people would come on the Sabbath day, and they would listen to teaching, and they would interact, and they would be in community and do all the things that we do in church. And Jesus is in this setting, right? So he teaches. And then, at the end, presumably, he looks over, and he sees this woman who is bent double, is what my translation says, for 18 years. Now, bent double, and I'm going to stand up just to kind of demonstrate this. I think we all know what this means. Like, this is bent, okay? This is bent. But bent double would have meant that she was literally bent all the way over. Can you imagine? And I saw a couple doctors and commentaries say that they could name a disease that I can't pronounce the name of it, but they said there is a disease out there that where your bones can be fused together and your muscles can act in such a way where this can happen. They think they can spot this. And so this happens to her. Now, this is also worth noting. Oftentimes when there's a disease reported on in the Bible, it'll say that someone had this from birth. Well, it doesn't say that about her. It says she's had it for 18 years, but you could kind of fill in the blank and think, okay, she probably had health for a while in her life too. Maybe she was walking around normal and healthy up till her early 20s or something, and then all of a sudden she started getting this disease that bent her over, doubled over like that, where she could not stand up for 18 years. How miserable would that be? Now, it also adds another note that in the modern age, we kind of might roll our eyes a little bit or be suspicious of a little bit. It says it was actually caused by a spirit. As soon as we say that, us in our modern times, we look at them and say, these people are kind of superstitious and they believed in that sort of thing. But we've seen throughout Luke a couple things. First of all, that Jesus himself believes that there are evil spirits. There's evil personalities in the world that we don't see that do affect things and can do things. But not only that, Luke doesn't always attribute sicknesses to that. Sometimes he just attributes it to biology, and that's just the way life is. There are just sicknesses, but there are also things that are caused by a spirit. So when you think about that, she's not only bent over physically, and she cannot get up. But not only that, because it's a spiritual thing, as if that weren't bad enough and hard on her, psychologically, it would have been something that's extra psychological because there's evil things at play there. I love one of my favorite preachers is a guy named Charles Spurgeon, a famous preacher from back in the 1800s. He had a poetic way of describing her situation. He said this: she, talking about this woman, walked about as if she were searching for a grave. That's the position where her head was and her eyes were. I do not doubt she often felt that it would have been a gladness to have found one. It's a great description of what this woman would have been going through. The depression, the anxiety, the frustration, all of that kind of agony. And Jesus stops, and I love it, and he points at her and he says, woman, you're free. You're free from your sickness. And then after that, he places his hands on her. Now, I don't know why, all the reasons he does that. This is the only person that's oppressed by a demon that he actually lays hands on. And I think it's because she had a combination of a spiritual and physical thing. But what does laying hands on do? As much as anything, he's living up to his nickname, the great physician. He's identifying with her. Our Westside campus pastor spoke last week and about a story that's similar to this about Jesus healing, and he made a great point in that. He said, you know what? Jesus was not a showman when he did this kind of stuff. He was a man of compassion. He wasn't a showman. In other words, he didn't light a bunch of candles and burn incense and dress in some weird outfit and do a bunch of incantations and make some big demonstration about things at all. He just said, woman, you're free. And then he lays his hands on her out of compassion. That's who he was, and that's what he did. Now, here's what you and I need to know as we step back and look at this. And I've mentioned this before. You know, if you were to go to most major universities around the world, and you were to go to the history department and they knew something about ancient history and Jesus' time and all that, and you found any professor, even an atheist professor, you were going up to an atheist professor and were to ask, what do we know about Jesus from history? What do we really know about him? I mean, true history that you're very, very confident in. What are some of the things we know? The vast majority of them, over 90% of the scholars would say, oh, we know that he was a Jewish rabbi that lived in the first century. He did go around and teach. We know that he was crucified by the Romans. He fell afoul with the law and he was crucified. That's virtual historic certainty. We know that his believers and followers believed that he had been raised again from the dead after he was crucified. But what we also know is that he was known to his contemporaries as a miracle worker, as a healer. Now, just because you don't believe in miracles, an atheist wouldn't believe that miracles happen, but the people back then would have. It was a mark of his ministry. He actually did miracles. They believed that he did. Now, I've also given you this before, but I got to come back because I'm going to give you some resources that are great to see. I'm going to recommend a book again. When it comes to this miracles, we're reading about this miracle story that so much of Jesus' identification is based upon. So here's a great book by Lee Strobel called The Case for Miracles. Highly, highly recommend this book. It's a great read. It's an interesting read. It's an accessible read. He also points to another book called Miracles by a guy named Craig Keener. And this book has been called, it's a 2-volume set. It's a scholarly work that one person called arguably the greatest work on miracles ever written in the history of the church. And what Craig Keener does is that he looks at stories like this in the Bible and he reports out that there are miracle stories going on all around the world that sound just like this. So when you hear the Bible reporting on Jesus, laying his hands on someone and they stand up straight and they haven't been able to do it for 18 years, he said these kinds of stories are out there. Now, it's worth noting, too, that Craig Keener has also released, there's an audio book out that just talks about miracles today. And that's his kind of less scholarly, accessible one, though. So if you don't want to read some 2-volume set about miracles, you can read about this stuff because they've been investigated. And what we're reading about is something that sounds like not only then, but also now. You can believe that this stuff is really going on. Jesus was a miracle worker, but he did it out of compassion. And he demonstrates compassion. And we see that coming out in the story as we travel through it. So if you want to be on Team Compassion, you need to know that Jesus is the originator in culture. He really is. Now this is worth noting, and we've talked about this in depth before, but I want to touch on it again because here's another book I want to kind of show you. And it's written by a guy named Tom Holland. It's called Dominion. Tom Holland wrote Dominion. And Tom Holland's story is that he grew up in church and kind of put aside his belief in God and all that kind of thing and went into his professional career. And he was absolutely obsessed with ancient people. He ended up being an historian. He's a documentary maker. He writes books all about ancient cultures, the Romans, the Spartans, the Greeks, the Persians. He just lived inside that culture. His hero is Julius Caesar. And watching these people live and studying this, knows a ton about it. But he said after a while, he started noticing something really bothered him about them. He was like, what bothered him was he knew that these people are absolutely brutal. They treated each other horribly. They treated life like it was worth almost nothing at all. They lived in a dominating culture. They killed one another. If a baby had a problem or seemed to have a deformity or something like that, to kill it, to throw it in a river was no big deal. Julius Caesar killed literally millions of people when he was on his conquest. And Tom Holland writes this. He says, quote, "It was just not the extremes of callousness that unsettled me, but the complete lack of any sense that the poor, the weak, might have the slightest intrinsic value. Why did I find this disturbing? Because in my morals and ethics, I was not a Spartan or a Roman at all. That my belief in God had faded when I was in the course of my teenage years did not mean that I'd ceased to be Christian." And he's not talking about being a follower of Jesus. He's talking about in Western culture, we have a compassion-based culture. We have hospitals and charities and orphanages and foster care, and all these kinds of things were not the way the world was before Jesus showed up. Jesus was the great physician. He is the one that brought it into culture the way, even if you're just an unbelieving person, your belief in the value and intrinsic value in people and helping the downcast and raising them up and giving to charity, you know who you have to thank for that? It's Jesus, the great physician, the great one who gave and showed compassion to people like he does this woman. Jesus is about compassion. Jesus is also, okay, so why should I trust and follow Jesus? Because he's about compassion. If I would be on team compassion, that's where I want to follow. But Jesus is also, here's another reason you should follow him, and I should follow him, and trust him. It's because Jesus is about freedom. Jesus is about freedom. So let's go back to the scene, all right? So he comes over and he says this woman is free, and and then he lays his hands on her, and she straightens up. Now get this scene in your mind. First of all, you've had her. She suffered from this for 18 years. It's clear. Jesus even acknowledges that. He calls it later. He says she's been under this for 18, and his quote was, long years. But that would also include everybody around her. She would have lived in this village arguably for most of her life, if not all of her entire life. She would have gone to this synagogue week after week after week after week. She was known in the community, almost certainly. Her parents were probably there with her. They traveled with her through it. Maybe she had children. There were family members around. There were people in her synagogue that had cried with her, that had prayed for her, that had agonized over her, that had struggled with. Everybody felt helpless. They all went through this. Sometimes it's almost as hard as going through it as watching someone you love go through something. You ever experienced that before? So she's got this is going on. And then Jesus does this. And for the first time in 18 years, she stands up straight. And it says she immediately began glorifying God. I mean, she raises her hands. She's probably singing her favorite worship song, doing the whole thing. She's standing up. And everybody around there, there's probably a couple hundred people in this synagogue and crowds outside and everything else, because Jesus is a pretty famous guy. They would have reacted first. I guarantee you there would have been a collective gasp, for one thing. Everybody would have been like, and everybody's eyes would have been this big, watching something like this happen. They knew it wasn't fake. They knew it wasn't phony. They had watched this go on. And they're watching her stand up right in front of their eyes. And so, and people are reacting the way people react. There would have been high fives going on, even though that wasn't invented for a while. They would have been hugging. Her parents, almost certainly, or people close to her, probably would have been weeping. Now this wasn't a miracle healing kind of thing, but it was through a doctor. But still, my wife years ago had a very dangerous tumor. It wasn't malignant, but it was a benign tumor that was growing at a rate. They said, if we don't get this out of you, it's going to burst and poison your insides. And not only that, she was pregnant with our oldest daughter. And so there was fears of losing the baby and everything else. And so we got to remove this tumor. So I can remember very clearly when that surgeon came back in that waiting room and he told me that it was successful and everything was going to be okay and the baby had made it through the surgery. I mean, I broke down. I broke down and I had one of those shoulders up and down, heaving, sobbing, crying for joy. The relief of the stress and everything. That's going on in this room, without a doubt. Then, in what is arguably the greatest buzzkill in the history of buzzkills, in the history of literature, and I can't think of a better word that better describes it than buzzkill, happens. So this is going on. There's absolute pandemonium in the best sense happening in the room. People are smiling and just hugging and doing all this stuff. And there's a synagogue ruler. I don't know, he's tapping on a guy. Ding, 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 ding. Attention, everyone. Attention, everyone. Attention, everyone. Attention. And then he launches into this thing. You've got 6 full days. You could have come to be healed. But we're not going to do that kind of thing on the Sabbath. That's when you should have come. Think about that for a minute. What a horrible thing, because it would have not only just been not, talk about being tone deaf to a situation. It wouldn't have only been that. More than anything, he would have just heaped a load of guilt all over that woman that had been delivered. She's over there raising her hand. She's singing. She's glorifying God, it says. And she would have heard that because she would have seen him as a religious leader that had authority. You should have done this a different day. Now, what he's really doing is he's talking to the crowd, it says, but we all know he was talking to Jesus directly. You ever been in a room where the boss, gets up and everybody knows one person is always late? But instead of talking to that person, the boss just kind of announces, all of us really need to be on time, not naming names or anything. That's what he's doing. He's kind of saying, okay, everybody, you should do this the other 6 days, but you can't do it now, right? But they all know he's talking to Jesus. And here's what I love about Jesus. And speaking of compassion and speaking of freedom, he gets kind of severe at this point. Jesus is not always just Mr. Nice Guy. What does he say? He says, you hypocrites, and he says plural. So there's probably some people behind him that kind of represent the Jewish leadership as well. He would have been speaking for others. You hypocrites. And then he refers them to rules that they believed in. You see, we know what they believed in because there's a body of literature out of Jewish tradition called the Mishnah and the Talmud. And in the Mishnah and Talmud, they have rules around what they believed about the Sabbath day. And one of the things that they did believe, and they talk about a lot, is they believed in the humane treatment of animals. That, especially in agrarian society, people need to take care of their animals and not work them on the Sabbath day. And Jesus brings this up. He said, you've got an ox, you've got a donkey, and he knew the rules that they would not have an oxen on the Sabbath day pull a plow. They would not have a donkey carry a load. But he said, what you will do is you'll take those animals to give them water. You'll give them the basics that they need as animals. You'll take care of them, and that's a good thing. Then he says, hey, how much more? This is as basic as it gets. This woman was bent over physically. She's being tormented mentally. And you mean to tell me that we can't do this on the Sabbath day, and Sabbath literally means rest day, to give her the best rest she's ever had in her entire life? You mean to say that? And he goes on to say his enemies were humiliated because he said that. But the people were rejoicing. So they got to turn around and say, okay, the guy tried to kill the party. We're all going to turn around. The party's back. Check it out. This is amazing. Jesus was about freedom. He said, you're free. He saw his mission, and he actually says that about himself. I've come to loose the chains. And he saw this woman bound in physical and mental and emotional chains, set her free. But not only that, Jesus had a view of how God did things as leading to freedom. There's a passage in the Bible, it's in James, that says that it describes the law of God, and it says the law of God is the perfect law that gives freedom. It gives freedom. It's the way to freedom. When you do things God's way, it's actually the road to freedom. Because where the Sabbath day came from was originally God took people who had been slaves for 400 years, generation after generation after generation after generation, for 400 years had been slaves. They had never known what it meant to be a break. They got up in the morning and they worked, they went home at night, they ate and they went to sleep, and they got back up the next morning and they did that generation after generation. They'd never known a break. God releases them from slavery. He gives them a rule. He says, here's how it's going to go with everybody. Every 7 days, I want you to take a break, take a rest. But you know what he also did? He also, throughout their entire calendar year, he gave them festivals where he tells them you are not to do any work during these festivals. And they were 7-day-long festivals. They were supposed to eat and drink and hang out and have a good time and rest. That's the perfect law that gives freedom. Jesus is about freedom. He says in another place about the Sabbath day, he says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. God's rules are made for us, not against us. Jesus is about freedom. Now the problem is that we'll kind of think, oh, well, in that case, we interpret freedom as, well, I can do whatever I want. That's what that means? No. Freedom, rightly understood, I'd say it this way. Freedom is recognizing that the ways of God are the way to life. Freedom is recognizing that the ways of God are the way to life. Because think about it. Is freedom doing whatever you want? Have you ever done whatever you want and it's not been freedom at all? I remember when I was a kid, I was a senior in high school. I might as well have been a kid. I was a senior in high school, and me and a buddy were kind of talking back and forth. We didn't like our lives. We didn't like our jobs. We didn't like school. We didn't like this and that and the other. So we came up with this great plan. We were just going to hit the road, take as many drugs as we could, and just travel on and skip our jobs and skip school and just go. We were free to do whatever we wanted to do. 8 hours later, we had no money, no gas, no food, no direction. We didn't even know where we were, and we had to call and have somebody. We were in a prison of our own making. It wasn't freedom at all. Freedom is recognizing that the ways of God are the way to life, and that's what Jesus is about. So here's the thing. Jesus has always been about compassion, and one of the reasons you should trust and follow him is because he does feel the pains that you feel, and he cares about those things, and he puts that in his people to care about those things when they're on their game and when they're listening to him. He identifies with the hurt, even the hurts you've delivered to yourself, whether it's sickness or emotional distress or any of that. And if you need compassion, I would encourage you to call out to him and say, Jesus is the great physician. Heal me, deliver me, help me, have compassion on me. And he loves freedom. He wants to set you free. And we can pray that way. And that's why we should trust and follow him. Let's pray. Lord, thank you very much that you're about compassion and you're about freedom. And I thank you for the compassion that you've shown me in my life, that you've released me from so much of my own self-destructive ways. I've seen you heal people. I've seen you heal me with physical illnesses or other challenges in life. I've seen it over and over and over and over again. I know you do miracles throughout the world. And I pray for people who desperately need, right now, they need compassion over struggles that they're having, whether it's addictions or physical illnesses or just oppressions, or they feel trapped inside their own lives with decisions they've made that they know have led to their own prison. I pray that you release them. I pray that your compassion will be known and felt and freedom will be experienced. In Jesus' name.